Uh, Welcome to the bridge. My name is Jason. I'm originally from sunny California, now living in beautiful Beijing. Today, our special guest is Dr. Immanuel Ness, whose research and published scholarly work focuses on the political economy of comparative labor movements, workers' social organization, global South political economy, and contemporary imperialism. Ness is a senior research associate, the Department of Sociology, Center for Sociological Research and Practice, University of Johannesburg, and professor of political science at City University of New York. He has written more books than I could count. It was hard to find them all. His latest, Migration as Economic Imperialism. Welcome to the bridge to China, Professor Ness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Smith. Very honored to be here.
Well, you can call me Jason. I'm really excited. We've been in communication for the last couple of months, on and off, and you've mentioned you've come to China. Could you tell us a little bit before we get started, a little bit about what brings you to China and when that started?
I'd been coming over the years to China and admired the level of development that has taken place over the last 3, 4 decades. What has brought me back is my interest in the very vibrant workers' movement and the All China Federation of Trade Unions, which I consider to be the most democratic trade union movement in the world. It actually gives citizens the right to be in a union, something that you don't have in any other country of the world, and it is very effective. So I also have studied labor, and I have I'm also very much interested in the topic of international peace. I'm a member of the U.S. Peace Council, which is a part of the World Peace Council, and China has a branch of that. And we had a delegation. I was part of a delegation that went there November, December of last year, and we met with the Chinese People's Association for Peace and Disarmament, and discussed various issues related to how there can be greater levels of harmony between the United States and China. So,
That is yeah, that's a topic that I'm personally very interested in, and one of the reasons I joined this program to interview people like yourself. I mean, before we get started with some of the questions that I wanted to ask, could you tell me what you think is preventing the United States and China from having deeper diplomatic ties and more friendship? What roadblocks do we need to move out of the way?
I think that there is great possibility for China and the United States to work together on multiple issues and to engage in trade and have cultural exchange, intellectual exchange, academic exchanges, and so forth. I feel very strongly that it is not only possible, but it could happen if we had the right people who are leading the United States. Can I say that? Uh, and I don't think that's necessarily um, the case right now, but hopefully that will happen in the near future. I think that there's a need for greater understanding amongst Americans, I would say, for the uh, eh, contributions of China to the world and in improving uh, the prospects for peace around the world, as well as prosperity. Uh, I think that more Americans need to know about the initiatives that China is engaging in that are all directed at peace, as well as its important contribution to the U.S. economy, to tell you the truth. I mean, without China, the United States would not be as wealthy as it is today. For instance, living standards have grown dramatically because of the capacity of Americans to buy commodities at low prices, which is dramatically improving American living standards over the last 2, 3 decades, and continuing to do so. And I think Americans need to understand that, and uh, the kind of work that you do is contributing to that I mean, sense of understanding. And uh, we just need more people like you to give the giving a sense of what China is like and what it's about. It's a peaceful country. It seeks to have uh, a peace around the world. It's a country that actually knows um, who it is, and like I think the Americans don't really have a sense of who they are themselves. So how could they know what China is? In my view, America is a very young country with very short history, unlike China. So I think that Americans have a sense of um, kind of uh, ignorance about themselves and the rest of the world, and maybe in some
That's
way, yeah, go ahead.
no, that's a fascinating. I've never really thought of that. Because I come here to China. One of the things I hear in China a lot is Chinese culture. Do you like this about Chinese culture? Do you like Beijing opera? Do you like? They're always bringing up Chinese cultural attributes and asking me what. So as I've gone along as an American suburbanite from California, I've tried to think, oh well, what is my culture then? And when they're talking about their, so like I said, baseball or football or like fast food, and so I'm trying to imagine what it is that my culture actually is as they're talking about their culture so confidently. So that's a very fascinating thing for you to have said. I do want to ask about your book because I was a little confused when I first saw the title, about migration. And so obviously it's a very controversial topic, but the angle that you take is not what I expected as I started to make it through the pages. So I really want you to elaborate for our listeners a little bit about what your take is. So your latest book takes up this issue about immigration, and well, I'd really like to ask, what is temporary migration program? What is a temporary migration program, and why are they set up, and why are they failing global workers from the global south?
Well, temporary migration is the dominant form of migration that is being advocated by economic leaders and political leaders around the world, especially in the capitalist West, but also in other regions of the world that produce for the West and so forth. First of all, I would say that there's an absolute need for migration in the West as their populations age, and that's happening very rapidly. And migrants fill that job category. In addition to that, there is a great need for migrants to engage in the kinds of labor. The five major areas of labor would be, including domestic services, would be agriculture, construction, uh, manufacturing, I have to say care services, which I just discussed, as well as the platform economy, gig work, which is ubiquitous in the West, especially the United States.
So I
And
mean, go ahead. I'm sorry.
well, it's
Go ahead, sir.
oh yeah, and I would say that there's a high level of uh, uh, a great need amongst Western countries as well as countries that are producing for the West for migrant labor to work at very low rates because it contributes to profitability. And at the same time, while there's profitability, those workers do not necessarily benefit as a consequence of it. So temporary migration usually lasts anywhere from 6 to 9 months to 3 years, and people can only go there for a specific. There would be the country of destination for that specific amount of time that is designated by the agreement between two countries, and you have to find a employer before you go. And there are a lot of rapacious elements to it in terms of deportation and so forth.
Well, let me ask you a few obvious questions that would come to mind for someone who wouldn't understand this topic, and you can tell me why I'm wrong or what the case may be. So, workers come, let's say, from Latin America. They come into the United States to do agricultural work. They have legal permission to be here for 6 months, and they're working in agriculture. How does that not allow them to bring money back to their home country to live better, or does it?
Especially within the case of agricultural workers, there is very little money to be earned because wages are so low. It's not just California, by the way, it's all throughout the United States and Canada. So, for instance, apples and other fruits and vegetables are picked by migrant workers, and without them, the costs of essential food products would be 3, 4 times the rate, or you wouldn't have a lot of these fruits like oranges, apples, strawberries, raspberries, cherries, etc. So it is an immigrant workforce that does that, and many of them live in very poor conditions and are forced back to their country of origin by the United States. And this is the model of migration that the United States would like to implement, although it has not done so, implement more widely throughout industry. So you even have high tech workers in the Silicon Valley who are migrants from chiefly South Asia, India, who migrate for a defined period of time. They earn wages that are lower than US workers, yet those wages are far higher than what you can make in India. I would say that they're not as exploited as others because their wages are so high and they come from fairly prosperous backgrounds in the first place and are highly educated. But you can see how that's important to Silicon Valley and the US technology industry. What advocates for temporary migration would like to do is to extend it to every single industry in the United States so that uh, the corporations and individuals who hire them are beneficiaries, and when they don't need them anymore, they'll send them home, or they're forced to go back uh, under defined periods of time. So this is what I think the American capitalist class wants to see. It hasn't happened as yet because of the xenophobia that the population has toward migrants. Um, and there are a lot of other factors. But for instance, in Southeast Asia and Asia as a whole, notwithstanding uh, not China, there are temporary migration programs that are in effect. So, for instance, workers go from Indonesia to Vietnam and Malaysia to work. If you're lucky, you have the opportunity to go to South Korea in manufacturing and also for a defined period of time. So if you join a union, for instance, let's say in the auto sector of Korea, uh, you can only be there for 3 years or so, or 6 years at most, and then you have to go back. So you're integral to the work, but you're sent home very quickly afterward.
Mm.
Um,
I've also seen a great deal of workers from the Philippines going to work as caregivers in Japan and other places in East and Southeast Asia. I'm not really sure what the outcome is there. But I mean, underlying all of this is global inequality, which a lot of your other material also addresses. So I wanted to ask you, in the context of the slow development of the global south, in your assessment, why haven't some of the programs that have been in effect for the last half century under the IMF and World Bank, why haven't they been helping the developing world in the ways that everyone expected?
Yeah, that's another question, which is part of the book too. That The United States was the first country that came up with the idea that they have to help poor countries around the world develop. And their development model actually was one that was usually, highly extractive. So countries would receive direct foreign aid, or initially under the Truman administration, or subsequently foreign direct investment, and so forth and so on, to develop those economies. But what happened, especially in the last 30, 40 years, is that foreign direct investment became the major source of income. Banking transfers to develop industry, industries that in many cases were not necessary for these countries, that were not uh, related to their economies in any way. But one of the main features that has caused failure is the high levels of interest on that money. So, with respect to um, foreign direct investment, the IMF has uh, it's almost happens all the time, ubiquitously. The IMF guarantees that money, and countries default because of the high interest rates, and they have to undergo structural adjustment programs, which necessitate them to open up their economy to the world, to lower the value of their currencies and so forth, and to extract even more from their economies, and not develop those economies, but contribute to higher levels of poverty in most of the countries. It's happening a lot in Africa lately, as countries default on their loans. Even the countries that are considered to be the best cases of economic advancement, such as Ghana, for instance, or even Kenya, have defaulted on their loans and so forth. And this has become a very serious issue because of the high rates of interest and interest rates, um, and contributes to uh, a high level of dependence and uh, on the West, but not just dependence, but also uh, it creates a lot of poverty as a consequence of these programs. So, structural adjustment programs of the IMF will force countries to eliminate essential programs for women, for instance, to get uh, education and services and so forth. Will eliminate programs such as any kind of healthcare program to the degree that countries have them. And education is also hampered by that. So, for instance, it completely opens up the economy to Western, usually exploitation. I would say, in contrast, China has a very different policy, and if a country defaults, China has forgiven so many loans completely as a consequence of uh, countries unable to afford them. But China has actually developed Africa to a great degree.
Well, I want to come back around to that. You co-edited a book, the Oxford Handbook of Economic Imperialism. In the last few years, I've been reading Kwame Nkrumah quite a bit, and this is a quote I pulled. It is the sum total of these modern attempts to perpetuate colonialism while at the same time talking about freedom, which has come to be known as neocolonialism, foremost among neocolonialists is the United States. So I ask you, as co editor of the book, the Oxford Handbook of Economic Imperialism, what is economic imperialism?
It's a very good question. Well, if we the whole notion of imperialism as a whole is one that Westerners don't want to hear about because they think imperialism is something that took place centuries ago and so forth, and that they think about imperials, empires, and so forth. But what they don't recognize is the fact that imperialism has continued and grown in the 20 since the end of the Second World War till now, and is continuing. And economic imperialism is what, in a phrase, would be the way in which uh, valuable goods and services are extracted from poor countries, typically in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and they're extracted as a consequence of uh, the need for commodities and so forth in the West, uh, and the need for cheap labor, uh, and what the major theoretical framework would be is that that extraction takes place through the inequality of trade. So you can produce goods in um, say a country like Pakistan for a specific wage, and the good and service is sent to the West somewhere, and it is far more valuable in the West than it is in the country of origin. So therefore, um, the level of exchange is unequal between the two regions. And so we live in a world system in which the dominant countries are economically are in the West, and they profit enormously as a consequence of having cheap mineral products, for instance, oil and gas, and so forth and so on. I would argue that even today, that the United States has an imperialist policy and practices economic imperialism with respect to China in terms of the value of the goods that are produced in China are far greater than what they are sold for in the West. So that the U.S. dollar imperialism and so forth is another example of that. That the value of the dollar is far greater than it should be in terms of its goods and services that it produces, basically war. And that contributes to a diminution of the value of the goods, and how much people are paid for it, and how much countries can sell those goods for. Um, so, I mean, you mentioned the Philippines. I did some research in the Philippines on banana workers. They're banana workers. Philippines is one of the leading producers of bananas in the world, and those workers get paid maybe 12 cents an hour. Of course, we take purchasing price parity into consideration, and they're sold at really low costs. The best bananas get exported, and tropical fruits, etc., and they get exported to rich countries of the north. And the cost of those products are relatively low, all things considered, so that consumers in the West are able to have tropical fruits year round at a very relatively low cost. Of course, not and that the producers of those brand names of those products not necessarily produce them, but are in control of the system, the companies such as Del Monte or Chiquita, etc., they make enormous profits off that system.
I get a lot of economists on the show and a lot of people who study geopolitics, and I get different perspectives on the IMF and World Bank. I mean, very, very different perspectives. And so it's almost impossible for me to actually definitively say what's going on. And so when I look at their programs, if you look at their websites, what they say about themselves and what their advocates say, they say there are economists who are in fact trying to make third world, if we're going to use that, global south countries, undeveloped countries, underdeveloped countries, whatever term we want to use, have better economies through this concept of liberalism, liberalization of their economies by having the, opening things up and taking things away from state control and giving them to free enterprise. This is supposed to create the environment to create economic prosperity for these countries. In reality, it doesn't seem to be doing that, because I can find almost no cases where that has actually been effective. Other guests that I've had on the show have told me that the IMF and World Bank is deliberately replicating the exploitative practices of imperialism under the empires which ended in the 1960s and 70s in this new form, and they're using the Washington Consensus, or this concept of liberalization of these economies, to be the new cover for this exploitation, where Western companies can come in and buy up all the resources. Based on your own research, someone who has traveled extensively and has published enormous amounts of literature on the subject and teaches this, what do you think is actually going on? Are there well-intended people at these institutions, or are they in fact deliberately replicating or accidentally replicating the same sort of economic structures that existed under imperialism?
I'm not going to, I think that, I can't tell whether people are good or not, or whether they're honest in one way or another. What are their motivations? It's an interesting question to begin with. People have different motivations to join these agencies. I don't think you join the IMF because you think you're going to improve countries of the global south, especially countries that have experienced structural adjustment programs. I think those policies are, as you put it, Washington Consensus policies, neoliberal policies that seek to open up markets and open up markets for actually trade and export to the West without, at the lowest possible cost. And what they do is as I said, at the very top of your program, they eliminate the essential needs of these countries. So I don't think that the IMF and the World Bank really has a clear idea of what development is. I think what they think development is to, essentially replicate the United States or Western Europe models of development when it doesn't really conform. And if that were to take place, the world would not exist for human beings, because, for instance, the United States is the major polluter in the world by far, even though the data is incorrect on that subject, because they pollute not only through driving cars and using a lot of oil and gas in the United States, but they produce through buying commodities that are produced in other countries and produce pollution as well as CO2 emissions. And so those countries get stuck with the idea, that they're actually polluters, when actually that pollution is for the consumption in the West as opposed to there. And I think that's highly unfair. But so I would, argue that the development of the world really requires and this is something that many find a pill that is hard to swallow for many. My opinion is that the West has to reduce its standard of living, and it's something that's referred to as degrowth, which has been advanced by uh, economists such as Jason Hickel at London School of Economics, that in fact, if we want to see a world that is cleaner, and that is where we all can survive in terms of eliminating the high levels of CO2 growth, there is a need for less consumption in the West. And as you point out in a lot of your own work, the consumption in the West is really not helping people necessarily. The infrastructures of the West are very poor. There's no such thing as a uh, communal sense of developing a country in terms of creating infrastructure like metro systems and so forth, as you pointed out in your work and examples. Um, that So degrowth could be saying, well, we're going to eliminate or reduce the amount of automobiles that Americans have and replace that with public transportation, or maybe I would say exchange, gas, oil and gas producing automobiles for EVs, which are far less polluting than the typical uh, automobile that's dependent on oil and gas.
Well, I would hope that would be the outcome, but it doesn't seem like we're heading in that direction. Let's move on a little bit.
Yeah,
You said in an interview with Guerrilla History that China is gaining more influence in the global south. So I wanted to ask you, why are these underdeveloped countries choosing to partner with China in things like the Belt and Road Initiative or BRICS?
well, I would say there's a lot of reasons for that. I mean, first of all, in terms of productivity and efficiency, um, China has a far higher level of that than any place in the world. So, for instance, if you want to build a road or build a rail system, um, Ch China is able to do so efficiently and do so in a manner that has a high level of quality in terms of the durability of that infrastructure, and does so at a lower cost. And so, for instance, we can give, examples that American economists and politicians give, or I would just say basically political scientists give, geopolitical scientists, uh, uh, are examples of where China actually is doing extremely well for those countries. So, for instance, a country like Sri Lanka, China built a port for them, which is doing incredible uh, in terms of allowing Sri Lanka to export goods throughout the world. Just because the port may be controlled in a different way, doesn't mean that Sri Lanka is not benefiting from it. I feel that, I mean, it's not just me. He Rong Yan has written a very important study on the question of China in Africa as well, and demonstrates that what I referred to earlier as an unequal exchange is not happening with respect to China, but is highly prevalent in the West, where the West is not going to produce a rail line for the export of minerals uh, in a way that is beneficial to a country economically. It might actually lead to the country falling further into poverty and debt and so forth. And so I think that people have it upside down in the West. There's a great benefit to using China because um, they don't charge high levels of usury. In many cases, they provide um, the building of infrastructure for free or at extremely low costs. And so I don't think any project that the West has in mind would be in any case equivalent to that. And so there is this tendency to gravitate toward China amongst global South countries that know what they're doing and care about their countries. Of course, there are different types of countries around the world that are led by um, different types of leaders, but those that are actually concerned with developing their countries will opt immediately for China rather than the West, which will, basically put them into a debt trap.
Mhm. I was speaking with a leader from Senegal. I'm not going to say who recently, and he was saying that exactly what you're saying, that if there were more opportunities to get loans from China, that they would take them. But there's not always enough. There's too much competition for Chinese loans sometimes, so they're forced to choose alternatives. I wanted to ask you because I don't know about this, and so you are an expert in Chinese labor to some extent in a way that I'm not. And so I really wanted to understand what you know. I want to know what you know, at least the basics. How are workers in China doing? I understand that you recently published presented a work, Chinese Democratic and Mobilized Labor Movement. Can you please explain this to us? Like, I'm a 10-year-old child.
Okay, so I would say that I'm studying the Chinese labor movement. I have written on the Chinese labor movement. Uh, if I can say this, that I was writing a book on labor movements in the global South and comparing them, and they asked me to include China. So there was the case of various different types of union movements, and one thing I have to say at the very start is that China uh, is a workers' state in the sense that it really supports its working class. And of course, there are always exceptions to every rule. But even, if people go on strike, for instance, at a factory, I studied the factory that produces Adidas shoes, uh, athletic footwear in Dongguan in Guangdong province. And what I found was that actually the Chinese, even with respect to private companies that are operating foreign multinationals through contractors, in this case Foxconn. Uh, no, yeah, no, the name of the company was Yuewen. That they really cannot exploit the workers in the same way as, for instance, if you go to a place like India or just about anywhere in the world where the country itself is just motivated to exploit their working class to a very high level. That's not true in China. My work, I'm studying the democratic nature of the Chinese labor movement, something that I'm committed to doing because I feel, based on my research, that it is a democratic right to be in a trade union, and that most countries in the world, especially the West, do not make it easy for workers to join unions. In fact, the states actually essentially tried to prevent unionization. So in the United States, let's say as an example, if let's say a company like Mercedes goes to build a plant in South Carolina and workers are employed there, the company will engage in a strategy to try to ensure that there's no unionization there. And the same thing goes for the producers of what we call, I think, Nissan and virtually any transplant automobile company does not have any union whatsoever. However much the U.S. unions try to organize them, they can't because of the threat that the company will say that we're going to move and leave the location if you unionize. Well, in China, notwithstanding anything, that everyone is in a union who's a worker. Now, of course, there are variations to that theme in different ways, but everybody who wants to be in a union, and even in the newest industries, so the digital economy, where you don't expect workers to be in unions. China gets criticized by Western leftists even for being difficult, not supporting its working class with respect to digital workers who are maybe working for Matuin or Didi, etc. But actually, if you look at the unionization rate amongst those workers, it is actually very high, close to 25%, based on the ILO data. Where basically unionization in these sectors anywhere else in the world is about zero, just about zero. And in China, actually, those workers have a right to be in a union. They have to form them, of course, and there are variations of unions that exist in China. But China is a country that has recently had a major demographic shift from rural areas to the urban centers. And so really China is a country of migrants, internal migrants. And that's the major, actually, demographic feature of China today, amongst others, and migrating to urban areas where people can improve their living standards. And countries that have high levels of urbanization generally have uh, much more advanced economies. So with respect to unionizing, that only helps the worker. And I believe that the All China Federation of Trade Unions, which is the state union, allows workers, I don't believe, based on my research actually, allows workers to organize the way they want to. But every worker is in a union, if not, but that doesn't mean every union is the same. So it's uh, and also this other question, with respect to technology, I hope this is clear. Uh, Technologically speaking, um, so we're now living in a digitized economy to a large degree. That workers always follow the direction of an economy. They're not the leaders of the economy. The capital and or the state develop new technology and apply it to the real world. And within that context, labor will always be behind to by at least a decade or so. So when people write about reserve army of labor, etc., in China, or workers who are not getting paid enough, and so forth. Well, the ACFTU and its constituent unions will catch up, and obviously the evidence shows that they are far ahead of any other country in the world. Of course, this is considered to be most Westerners will not agree with this position, but I'm committed to advancing this in a book I'm writing right now on the Chinese labor movement, which will demonstrate that the system is far more advanced than anywhere else in the world. And also, because of many policies that China has with respect to nationalities and so forth, um, worker rights are far greater. There's a propensity to improve the condition of those workers who had been marginalized. So, for instance, in Xinjiang province, uh, the Uyghur population, their standard of living is expanding dramatically, especially in the last 10, 15 years. Um,
Mm.
yeah, absolutely.
Well, there's been an enormous amount of state investment in Xinjiang to develop it as a new center of, economic growth. So I'm looking forward to. I'm taking another trip there in like 2 weeks, so I'm really excited to go see some of that. Most of what I'm going to be seeing though is solar panels and the way that they're developing their green infrastructure. But I'm very interested in your new book, and eventually we're going to have you back to discuss that, because I think that is exactly the kind of the stuff we want to have on this show. So it would be great to have you back to discuss your research into the labor movement in China. You know, I'm reminded of a couple of different things as you're talking about this, because we're also talking about migration. And you know, people that I know who are a bit older than me, when they were my age in China, were actually migrant workers to other countries. I know someone who moved to Kuwait for several years and worked as a worker in Kuwait as part of migrant labor to Kuwait to help develop their, you know, urban centers before moving back to China and taking some of that money back home. But also, you mentioned the workers that are on the periphery of urban centers here in China, because there are an enormous amount of urban workers around the super metropolises in China, like Beijing, Shanghai, Chongqing, and so forth. And most of these workers either they live in a compound that's built on site where the construction site is, and there's like a dorm of sorts that is there for the duration of that construction, or else they migrate into the city each day. So there are a lot of urban migrants coming into the very large cities here in China, and so I think that there's an enormous amount of material there. You probably could produce multiple books on this.
Yeah.
But I wanted to move on a little bit and
I
talk
wanted
about
to
the.
say, if I could,
Oh, go
I
ahead,
want to
please.
say, well, with respect to Chinese workers, what I really admire about Chinese workers is that they are militant and they know what their rights are, and they will try to advance those rights. The Westerners are just completely wrong about that issue, and what they want to see is basically a kind of national strike or something like that, where, first of all, it has nothing to do with China's uh, political um, way in which politics is exercised, but uh, it if people go on strike, they'll go on strike on a local level. So what's wrong with that? And why? I mean, there are some scholars, I wouldn't even call them scholars, uh, who are highly antagonistic to China, and they try to say, well, you didn't have a mass labor movement. Well, I beg to differ, uh, because first of all, maybe they didn't have a mass, or they're not having one right now because they're actually effective and representing workers in a way that is highly positive and advancing interests, especially in the state-owned enterprises. Wages have gone way up.
I would also say, I would add this. This is an important thing that I've been coming to terms with over the years. When I first arrived here, because I'm a foreigner, I have two sets of insurance. They give me, the posh insurance for international workers, but I also got a workers insurance card for health insurance. And I was kind of, at first I was just like, oh yeah, this is my national insurance. But it's not national insurance. It's actually workers insurance. It's for workers or people who have worked for more than 10 years. And so it's really interesting, after I thought about it for many years, that the entire incentive system based in China is built around the concept of workers, around working, not about just being a citizen, but of actually being an employed person. And I think that's really interesting. Obviously, there's health insurance for everyone, but it's called different things in different places. But you get a worker's health insurance card. And if you were a worker, a Chinese employee, a Chinese worker, you have a housing fund where the government almost matches everything your employer puts into your housing fund. So each month, a percentage of whatever you're being paid is matched in a housing fund, so that after 10 years or whatever, you go buy a house, whatever you and your employer have been putting in there, combined with what the government's been adding to it, it makes it ridiculously easy to buy real estate, to buy your personal home for you and your family. And so things like this are overlooked by people in the West who don't really understand China's system, who have heard one or two simple things and then begin to kind of imagine a system that is totalitarian or authoritarian, or not as worker oriented as it actually is. But the benefits that Chinese workers get are considerably greater than those that we enjoy back in our home in the United States. But we do need to move on. We have little time left. I wanted to ask you about the American working class, because for me, watching inflation, we've had about 1% inflation. It's varied a little bit here in China for the last 5-10 years actually, but in the United States we've seen inflation. I've seen the data. It's 9% sometimes, and for extended periods of time. So it seems like with wages not really increasing, that the American working class must be inordinately strained. But when I see Western economists in big publications, mainstream media publications, I see them saying, "Oh, the stock market's doing great. The economy is wonderful." So I wanted to get your perspective. What, does the American working class get a living wage? Are they, how bad is the struggle, and what do they need to do to get a living wage?
I think that one of the issues with the United States, very good question. First of all, inflation is going way up, and that this occurred especially after in the COVID period, and it's continuing to rise extensively. Obviously, it's related to the economy and so forth, and so it contributes to high levels of unemployment. Although employment has declined to some degree in the United States, yet at the same time, people don't recognize that fewer people are in the labor market, so that unemployment declines when fewer people are part of the labor market. So I would say that the United States is the most unequal wealthy country in the world. If you take a look at data, uh, the World Inequality Report that's produced by CIRRUS in Paris um, demonstrates very clearly that the United States has the most unequal economy of any rich country in the world. So there are high variations of wages in the United States, in which you have some people who are making, for the United States, we could say poverty wages, which is not the equivalent to other countries, and cannot afford. I mean, in New York City, no one can afford an apartment. We don't have the same system as China as a federal country, and so I mean, you can't keep up with your rent payments and so forth, and that leads to the people being evicted or people having to move. I know many people who are middle income or upper middle income earners, I would say, that have to move to new locations that are farther away from their work because they can't afford to live in New York. And that's happening not just in New York City, but as you know, major cities around the United States, housing costs have skyrocketed. And that's, one of the basic needs that people need in this country. And so homelessness goes up, or people live in, uh, uh, people can't live in, I mean, I even know people, people cannot live in dwellings that are uh, decent. Many people can't afford to buy homes and so forth. With respect to inflation and your question about the American working class, I would say that they are beneficiaries of, like I said before, of the tremendous amount of prosperity that China has given to the United States in terms of low-cost commodities. I mean, I don't know why the United States is thinking about these. I mean, it's these ridiculous programs about slapping tariffs on commodities. It only hurts the American working class. But they were the beneficiaries, and they are the beneficiaries of low-cost goods. If the biggest retailer in the United States, Amazon, I don't know, 50% of their products originate in China, at least. That's a low number.
I find it interesting because we have Amazon here as well. But one thing that I think American consumers are really missing out on is the new automotive industry that's emerging in the rest of the world. I wouldn't just say it's in China, because China is exporting an enormous amount of these vehicles. There's one vehicle I like to point out because I'm probably going to get it. I don't want a car personally, but my wife does.
Yeah.
So there's a BYD, which is it stands for Build Your Dreams in English here in China, and it goes 2,000 kilometers on a single tank of gas. It's a hybrid, and it costs in US dollars $12,000. Can you imagine how many Americans would go out and buy that tomorrow if they had access to it? But the United States is essentially, by putting 100% tariffs on it, keeping it out of the country, and it's just not the best interest for the United States consumers.
No.
I I'm not sure if we're going to have next time to include the next question, but I'm going to ask it anyway because I want to know. You co-edit, because I'm very interested in sanctions. I think a lot of people are increasingly interested in this idea. You wrote co-edited a book called Sanctions is War. And as we know, the United States is uses these liberally. They're the global leader in applying sanctions all over the place. What are the effects of sanctions on countries? Do they target the top, or is this hurting the poorest people in those countries?
I'll try to be as brief as possible. With respect to sanctions, first of all, I think they're misdirected at many countries, including China and North Korea. I'll be honest with you. They tend to hurt the populations in those countries and do nothing to change the policies, but actually of those countries. And I would say that those, in many cases, those policies shouldn't be changed. That they are benefiting the world as a whole. But I think the United States has gotten into this frenzy of applying sanctions to just about any country or any person who they don't like. It's their new form of foreign policy. But it basically hurts populations. There are many countries around the world that are sanctioned by the United States and European countries for no good reason at all, just because they're not part of their political orbit. But countries should have the right to decide what kind of economy and society that they want, and the United States should not dictate it. And so it's trying to advance its rules-based order, which has nothing to do with a law-based order that the UN advances, and so they're applied to countries that just disagree with U.S. policies, and they're applied in a way that is highly wrong and misdirected and hurt people who are at the bottom, not at the top.
I just want to thank you so much for joining the program, Dr. Immanuel Ness. Last question: if you want people to find your work or find you online, where is the best place for people to look?
I guess hashtag Immanuel Ness with an Immanuel Ness.
Thank you so much for your time, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Smith.